I think what they do is they say, right, okay, we have these values, and we recognize that you value those too. And actually, we aren't satisfied about trying to get harmonious balance. We want to bring them to their full apotheosis. If you don't bring them to their full apotheosis, you're falling short of your potential. And actually, we're just more honest and better than you. And I'm not satisfied yet as to how you stop them driving towards that absolute.
And that's how the Marxists win all of the arguments against the liberals as well. Like, I actually see Novara Media posting this quite a lot of the time. When the Conservative Party want to do something that is illiberal, they go, well, are we liberals or are we not? It's like, but you're a communist. And you're a public communist. But also, you recognize that liberalism is the method by which to achieve this communism because of the shared set of values that liberalism has. And so if the liberals appear to abandon freedom or equality, then the communists know that everything they want is off the table. So they see this is a method to get to where they want to go. Hang on a sec. And the problem, I think, fundamentally with the idea of being a conservative liberal is that you are just a conservative at this point, right? Because that's why the classical liberals are the Tories and everyone else is the Labour Party and the left, because there's a kind of inherent dialectic in leftism that drives everything to this particular point of extreme abstraction. And so you have been folded into the right because you've got nowhere else to go, because there's a sort of a cutting edge of liberal philosophy that is still scything away, and it's gone past you. And so now you're like, okay, but I want to get back to where I thought things ought to be. But the thing is still going, and it's still getting more and more ridiculous, right? And so the argument has been lost by the classical liberals on that.
I agree with a very large extent with what you're saying, but I think there is something that is missing, and that is the dialectic, if you would like, between utopian thinking in politics, which will always, the pure ideological purists will always tell the actual practitioners of doctrines, you're forgetting your values. You're forgetting your values. So that's what I think it happens. And it reminds me of Aristotle, as he was saying that in politics, there are all sorts of levels at which we can make evaluative judgments. There's the ideal. There is the ideal in the circumstances. And then when you see that politics is not as good as that, you see that there's a good thing to do in the circumstances. So what you're describing, I fully agree. I fully agree with respect to the idea that there is an inner logic in driving things that way intellectually. But I disagree with respect to losing the argument there, because what you can do when people constantly talk about utopian ideas, you can show them at failed experiments. And actually, 100 years ago, there weren't so many failed experiments. But there are.
But this is why they would say, well, that wasn't real communism, right? Because it didn't manifest the ideal in reality, and therefore the ideal is still untouched. But the ideal remains. And the thing is, the ideal will always remain untouched. Because, of course, the ideal will never be manifested in the real world.
But a key part of the argument, and I'll stop. Sorry. The key part of the argument here, and that's fun because it takes us to something that we said in the beginning, is that one of the reasons why they say it is because they would say that if you look at the actual trajectory of communist regimes, you won't see them developing in industrial countries. You will see them developing in primarily agricultural economies. That is why they say it didn't happen as Marx promised. So the fact that it didn't happen as such, it happened in other ways, means that the actual experiment, the socialist experiment, wasn't tried. By the way, just say that communism is the end state. So just saying communism hasn't already been tried is just like saying we haven't reached what the communists are saying utopia. So we could say actual socialism.
Can I follow up on why I think actually liberalism accelerates this dialectic? I think there is a utopian strain in liberalism in its presumption of the universality of man. And it's founded in part in the anthropologically incorrect foundation myth that we talked about before, with the state of nature. But this is something that's often expressed. I think using Angela Merkel here is actually a good idea. Douglas Murray's written about this, and so has Eric Kaufman. Back when there was a mass influx of asylum seekers, back in about 2014. She was telling the German people to adopt a yes, we can mentality, because otherwise we won't achieve, and this was a near direct quote, universal human rights in the kind of Europe we dream of. And the point is, by valuing progress, as you've said you yourself do, and again, different definitions of progress from
I
the
think you
historicists.
value as well.
I don't. I actually don't, though. Valuing progress and valuing kind of universality unmoored from a religious tradition that has a foundation for it, what you do is you drive towards bringing freedom and equality into universal fruition. And so that means that, again, the Marxists have another angle of attack of saying, well, actually, you're not progressing fast enough and it's not universal enough, so you should accelerate the logic that liberalism itself holds. I think that's almost like the fuel in the engine. You know, that's another worry that I have.
I have a quick question just about universalism. I think that this may well, this is, not something I'm necessarily certain about, so I'm throwing out an idea, but this is something that I think is just a tendency of human beings more generally, in that there's a theory in psychology, one that I actually based my master's dissertation on, called construal level theory. Basically, the distance from your own personal experience, you venture more into abstraction and imagination, the further away from pragmatic details you move in your style of thinking, it becomes more abstract and ideological. And I think that you don't necessarily need empirical research to
That's
to feel
pretty straightforward.
It is,
that
yeah.
makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that quite often, because the sort of perfect example of a liberal universal ideal not mapping onto a society that isn't, say, in the Northern Hemisphere or European or what have you, or North American, would be the sort of British and Americans trying to impose liberal democracy on Iraq. That would
Or
be
on
like,
South America.
yeah, and these are cultures which we didn't really have a complete understanding of because we hadn't had first-hand experience. And I think I make experience the gold standard of everything. Even sort of empiricism is a form of experience, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's a very important thing. So I think that there is this tendency built into people. It's more of a psychological dimension and a predisposition of human beings, as opposed to something in liberalism. You could perhaps make the argument that liberalism allows you to manifest this more often, but I don't know what form that argument would take.
Well, it's inherently abstract and ideological, right? It bases itself on the idea of a universal pre-social man, which is just...
I would also argue as well, going back to the technology question, that the inherent valuing of technological progress via liberalism allowed us to increase our remit of moral consideration to a wider portion of the world, because we're folding them into liberalism via prosperity, via technology, via the internet. Just seeing and discovering the world and getting them more in the conversation means we think that we have a right to impose our values on them because we can see and talk to them. That's an outgrowth of that philosophy.
I would have basically said the same thing.
Also provides us with a measurable way of demonstrating superiority.
Yes.
As in, we have better technology, we have a higher GDP.
Yeah, managerialism gives us the impetus to be imperial.
Yeah, we have the numbers to say we are better than you. I mean, but of course, why we've got a dead spiritual life and society's falling apart. And some Amazon jungle tribe, they're like, none of us need antidepressants.
Yes.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
So, are we really better? And so, but this, I think, is the problem with sort of value pluralism in the particular case of liberalism, is that it doesn't broach other values really. If anything threatens liberalism, that thing is the problem and has to be stopped. It will never concede that it should have a lower value than something else. And that's why liberalism has brought us to this point. This is why we're currently being inundated by illegal invaders. Right? It's liberalism that prevents this. And the Conservative Party is like, we can't touch that. The Labour Party are like, we're never going to touch that. That's what we want, And so we're trapped in a liberal paradigm, even though it doesn't make any sense from any other paradigm. Like the protests in London that might happen this weekend. So who knows when you'll get this? Don't know what will happen. It's recorded before the protests, right? It's just not a question from any other paradigm as to whether a group of foreign interlopers into a civilization should be allowed to disrupt what is essentially one of the most important holy days of that civilization? It's just not a question. Because the answer is, of course, no. Right? The answer is, in all times, in all places, no. In every other civilization that's ever existed, apart from right now, and suddenly a bunch of Muslims are going to be allowed to desecrate the cenotaph, interrupt possibly interrupt the ceremony, or at least go and clash with a bunch of protesters who are patriots for this civilization. And they have equal moral worth as the people who don't want that to happen and who want to go there and just show their respect to their own civilization. Like, that is bonkers. That is absolutely bonkers. Like other civilizations would hang these people. Like, the Romans would crucify them if they were to go and desecrate the Temple of Juno or something on some bloody feast day. You wouldn't even think about it, because this would be the highest value. But liberalism is looming over all other values, saying, no, no, no. My values are the most important ones, and these people who want to desecrate your civilization, even though they don't belong here and they've only arrived here in the last 5 minutes, they're just as important as you are.
I've written an article on this. Sorry, I just thought I'd add that we can put in the description because it will be published by the time this is done. The analogy you can use for that is that liberalism believes it is the container in which it can mitigate all value conflicts.
It is the value under which all other values must live.
So it thinks by the concept of universal inherent human rights that each person shares, that it can have value pluralism as long as you respect those rights. And so that's where you get the concept.
Sorry, can you repeat this?
Liberalism becomes the parameters in which it can think it can mediate all cultural conflicts, because every person has inherent universal human rights, and all they have to do is recognize those rights, and then all other value conflicts will be subordinate. And so the problem that you have, this is how you develop multiculturalism in liberalism and no other real paradigm, is because liberalism thinks of itself as a melting pot. Now, by melting pot, it means a crucible. It means that if you put things into it, the impurities will be stripped away and you'll have pure metal over time. What actually happens is liberalism functions as a blender. It puts all of the ingredients in. What it doesn't realize is the most dominant ingredient in there will leave a bitter aftertaste in there. And that's why I think it's unique to subversion, because it presumes that everyone else's conflicts will strip away if they recognize those human rights. This is why they allow both protests to coexist.
Yeah.
What it doesn't realize is if one protest doesn't necessarily value those human rights, because they clearly don't, then it will just dominate the liberal paradigm.
But also the liberal paradigm is defenseless against it.
Yeah.
It has no judgment against those people in doing, because liberalism is myopic in its vision, right? It can't see the wider cultural context in which a civilization exists. And so it can't recognize that actually these people don't have the human right to go and ruin and it could be anyone's ceremony anywhere in the world. If there are a bunch of British people in Spain who are invading some sacred Spanish national holiday, I'd be like, just deport every one of them, mate. You've got the absolute right to do it, but that wouldn't be a liberal thing to do. And this is the problem with liberalism. And just a quick thing, it's not that other cultures don't have ways of dealing with subcultures within themselves. They absolutely do. They just deal with them in a hierarchical way. And liberalism, because of its commitment to equality, can't recognize that is a natural part of human existence.
Okay, so you're raising too many issues here. I'll try to address some. Do you want to go first?
I was just going to say that it was only kind of a throwaway point, then you can carry on, is that at sort of the height of the British Empire, Britain in India, we stopped was it the wife burning? I can't remember the exact name of it.
Burning of widows, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But is that not an example of people coming from a liberal system and asserting their values over someone else?
Well, it's people coming from a highly traditional system, and we are definitely asserting our values, but asserting values is not the issue. Like the dominant group will always assert their values on the inferior group, right? That's just normal, right? All places and all times. That's what happens. It's the dominant liberals who are imposing liberalism on everyone else. But the burning of widows would be objectionable to British people in the 10th century. The Anglo-Saxons would have been, why are you burning this poor woman? You don't have to be a liberal to object to the burning of a widow.
That's a fair point, actually, yeah.
And it just, again, traditionally...
They're going through some women troubles.
I appreciate
sympathetic to the notion, that's all.
Yeah, it's not
that's a joke, by the way.
It's not that happening. But the point is, it's not because of liberalism that we would object to that, or it's not the only reason. So... yeah.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.